Hello, podcast friends. We are going to nerd out about dopamine today. But before we get into that conversation, I want to normalize something. And I think in particular, I want to normalize for those of us who are really nerdy about the things that we're nerdy about and who feel like we need to have a very polished version of that thing before we teach about it. So if you've been around here for a minute, you know that I am a nervous system nerd, and I can talk about nervous systems, I think, in my sleep at this point. I've been, teaching about nervous systems for over a decade now, and so it is something that, the information is just, right there on the surface, ready to be picked. Dopamine's a little bit different for me. Even though I learned about dopamine when I was in grad school many, many years ago, I think at this point it's 15 plus years. It's not something that I feel really natural about when I talk about it yet. And so this is the first time I'm talking about dopamine in a public way. And what you're hearing is a much more scripted version of that conversation that I'm used to having with folks. So usually with my workshops and even my podcast where I'm coming on and saying things just like chat with cat style, I have a bit of a backbone laid out, but I like to have a lot of free flow, a lot of space where I can sort of explore these different ideas. Dopamine's a little bit different. It's a complicated thing to talk about. I don't want to oversimplify it, and I don't want to forget anything as I'm in my sort of space of learning how to teach about this. And so I think the real thing I want to normalize here is it's okay to feel awkward about the things that you're teaching about. And for me, when I am in learning mode, one of the best ways that I can learn actually is to teach about it. So you're catching me in a moment of growth. You're catching me in a place that 5 years ago, Kat would have never put this out because I was still sort of in that space of perfectionism. And when I listened back to this, there were moments that felt a bit cringy because I'm not as practiced about talking about this thing. So I want to model what I teach, which is you don't have to have it perfect. You don't have to have it be this completely polished expert thing that you're in. I do think that I'm an expert in the body, but again, dopamine is brand new for me, and I'm making these links that I've not really heard other people making before when it comes to dopamine and the spiritual entrepreneurship journey. And so I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being in the space of exploration and in the space of me learning myself, how do I want to talk about this? So on that note, here is the episode. And I really, really I just want to make a note that I really love having conversations with folks. And so if there's something in this episode that sparked your interest, or you're oh my gosh, I want to know a little bit more about this thing that you said, or hey, is there a way that you can explain that differently because it didn't quite land for me, particularly in this space of learning and teaching at the same time, those comments are welcome. So I'm super friendly on Instagram at cat.hosoo.lee, or you're welcome to email me. I'm always there. hello@cathosoolee.com. Chat soon. Okay, so a little bit of an intro into what we're going to get into today. I created this specifically for folks who are in the spiritual entrepreneurship world. And if you've ever felt ungrounded while launching an offer to your community, this is the perfect place for you. We're going to be talking a lot about dopamine, which is a molecule that's responsible for motivation and drive and desire and pleasure. And I want to talk about how this little molecule affects so much about how we feel and take action as spiritual entrepreneurs, particularly as we're launching an offer to our community. And just as a little sweet little snippet, dopamine is what turns on when you have a desire and a craving to do something. It's also that thing that helps you get off of your couch to go do that thing. And when you actually get that thing in your hands, you also get a little spike of dopamine. And so that thing could be a pint of ice cream, a new romantic partner, a drug, It could be scrolling on Instagram, a new puppy, or new clients, which is what we're going to talk about here today. So, full disclosure, I felt inspired to have this conversation with y'all because I'm in the middle of launching Business Alchemist mentorship right now, and dopamine feels very much present. If you're like me, launching can feel incredibly ungrounding, and that's why I want to talk about this. Because I look around at social media and I look at how other coaches are talking about launching stuff, and I see them putting on this like facade of confidence and groundedness and excitement while they're launching, and they leave all this uncertainty and fear out of what it is that they show us. And that's not what I'm about, and so we're going to talk about it from a different perspective. So as I sat with my own fears and uncertainty, I could feel dopamine taking up space in my own body. It was taking up space in a way that historically has felt incredibly familiar. So I dusted off some notes from school. I reread and re-listened to some material and some research about dopamine. And that is what finally helped me just take this like nice big exhale about launching. Because everything that I've been feeling for the last several weeks during this launch, everything that I felt about every other launch that I've done is totally understandable. It's totally understandable that I am a little bit more activated right now, that I'm feeling worried, that it's a little bit harder to sleep, that I'm scrolling Instagram more, that I'm craving a bit of junk food, that I'm living a little bit less presently, a little bit more in the future. All of this is understandable. And the why is completely explained by this tiny little neuromodulator called dopamine. And now that I understand it, it's my responsibility to find ways on how I can support myself through this launch. And that's really what I want to talk about with you all. I want to share the biology of dopamine. And if biology scares you a little bit, don't worry, you don't need to have a history in like cell biology or understand that. I'm going to really simplify things for us. And I also want to talk about how it shows up in the life of a spiritual entrepreneur, particularly during a launch when you're seeking clients. That dopamine is all about seeking and getting. And I also want to share tangible tools on how to work with dopamine instead of denying it, suppressing it, or letting it control your life. So by framing all this information in the context of this real world example of launching, it's going to give us an opportunity to introduce some tools and frameworks that you can use. But even if I'm using this example of a launch, my hope is that you feel empowered to use this example and then you apply it to relationships, to personal goals, and really so much other stuff in your life that involves around seeking and receiving and getting. So, I'm getting into the practice of like re-saying, I guess we're in the middle of a rebrand. And so I've like changed how I introduce myself. So I'm putting myself into the practice of that. And so in this little safe, cozy container here, that's then going to go out into the podcast. I just want to like say that out loud. Hi, I am Kat HoSoo Lee. There's some new faces here. There are some familiar faces here, some folks who have been through BAM already. And so I feel like I'm in this like perfect little like cozy space. I am an emotional alchemy coach. I'm also a spiritual business mentor, and I'm the host of the Emotional Alchemy podcast. And I love playing in the space where science and spirituality converge, because this is where we get to experience emotional alchemy. So in my work, I educate space holders about somatic physiology and environmental biology so that they can deepen their practice of listening and presencing, which ultimately helps them expand their capacity to hold space for other people. As a spiritual business mentor, I guide soulful entrepreneurs to approach their business as a spiritual practice. And the work bridges the emotional landscape with practical tools, which allow them to cultivate businesses that are rooted in conscious values, in relational marketing, and in purposeful service. So today, I tried to do an experiment. I tried to go on YouTube Live, and I often think about business as a series of experiments, and it didn't work out so well. The audio didn't pick up. And so now we're here in Zoom, and I get to play this out in real time with you guys. And so thanks for being flexible. For those of you who are listening to this on the podcast, I'm really glad that you're here and you get to hear the recorded version of it, because the first 10 minutes of our talk was me trying to figure out audio. So let's talk about dopamine. The first thing I'm going to do is let's bring this into somatics, right? So I'm going to invite you all to place your hands somewhere on your body. Doesn't matter where. Just somewhere on your body. And I'm just going to ask you to sink into what that feels like in your body to have your hands on your body. Are you able to feel your body? How's your breath? Maybe just do a quick little glance down at your hands. What's within your immediate visual field? What are the sensations that come up when you look down? What are some of the textures that you can feel beneath your hands? For me, I sometimes have to close my eyes to shift into the here and now. And that shift into the here and now, when the only thing that matters is what's right in front of us, when the to-do list disappears and sensation is the only thing that exists. This is all being modulated by what is being classified as H and N neurotransmitters. The H and N neurotransmitters, what's included in that umbrella are oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. And endorphins are the body's version of morphine. We have also got endocannabinoids, which is the body's version of cannabis. And what these neurotransmitters do is they allow us to experience and savor and enjoy what's in front of us, or they can help us fight or flight our way out of a sticky situation. So now, by contrast, I want you to focus on something that is just outside of your reach. Like focus on an object that's just outside of your reach. It could be something that's just sitting on your desk. It could be a coffee mug, whatever is just kind of outside of your reach. You have to go out and get it. And now go actually touch that thing. Just that simple act of you focusing on an object that's outside of your reach and touching it meant that your body and your mind had to shift from the H and N neurotransmitters and shift into a neuromodulator called dopamine. So dopamine makes us desire what you don't yet have. It drives you to seek new things. It rewards you when you obey it. It punishes you when you don't achieve it. It loves novelty. It inspires our creativity. It is why we become addicted to substances and activities. It fuels our dreams and it gives us the gas to accomplish them. So I am a nervous system nerd. I view the world through the lens of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of our bodies, and I've been doing that for over a decade. It's how I teach emotional alchemy. It's how I teach spiritual business. And it's a framework that quite frankly, I can't shut that off. I view everything in the context of how threatened or safe does your nervous system feel in different situations. And to me, the nervous system gives us that context of safety, but it doesn't completely explain how we behave sometimes. Why do some people cheat on their partners? Where do addictions come from? Why do some people thrive as entrepreneurs while others struggle at every turn? Why does it seem like we are chronically unsatisfied, even though most of us no longer have to worry about our literal survival? Why do we compare ourselves to others? Understanding dopamine brings in color to what has felt like a black and white painting. And I'm so glad that I get to share a snippet of that with you today. So, what is dopamine? Dopamine is a neuromodulator. And what that means is that it is a molecule that communicates from the brain to many, many different types of tissues and systems in the body at the same time. You'll often hear dopamine being referred to as a neurotransmitter, but it doesn't fully capture its full functionality. Andrew Huberman is a podcaster and he talks about dopamine quite a bit in his podcast. And I'm going to use his analogy of how he explains the difference between neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. Just as a note, he has a really great podcast episode that's called Controlling Your Dopamine for Motivation, Focus, and Satisfaction that's worth listening to. So neurotransmitters, imagine that you're at a concert and you're sitting next to your buddy. Neurotransmitters are like the two people trying to talk to each other in that concert. It's like a very intimate sort of situation. It's a very, bi-directional, I guess, sort of a situation. Neuromodulators are like the band. So the band is the beat that gets everyone in the crowd to dance in this like coordinated, organic way. And that is what dopamine is. It's like the band. So this is why dopamine is such a strong influencer. It affects us on the physical, the emotional, and the nervous system level. It can invoke responses like how fast our heart rate is moving. It's involved in our craving for burritos, and it is also the driver for how we go get that burrito. Dopamine works with the nervous system to say, let's turn on this set of neural circuits. In particular, dopamine has two different pathways that it works through, and we can simplistically call these the desire circuit and the control circuit. And in today's conversation, we're going to speak about the desire circuit because it's the most relevant to our life and experiences as spiritual entrepreneurs. And I also don't want to turn this into like a 6-hour lecture. I have no idea how long this is going to be, by the way. So as a reminder, dopamine is all about desire, motivation, craving, and drive. So why would this be important to our biology? Dopamine is strongly tied to our survival, not just as humans, but as animals that seek resources outside of ourselves. So dopamine is the universal molecule that is about foraging and seeking. So even earthworms have dopamine because they have to go outside of their own bodies to go find food. Dopamine has everything to do with how motivated you are, how connected you are to your desires, and your capacity to push through effort. Now, I say forage, which in today's terms kind of sounds very cozy, Instagram, cottagecore, homesteadcore. But imagine that you lived in the Paleolithic era when our ancestors were surviving off of what they could just forage, not what they could find in a grocery store. So for our ancestors, going and looking for something was a dangerous endeavor. So to have the drive to go outside of what is known and safe, our ancestors needed a strong boost of dopamine to give them the oomph that's needed to move outside of comfort and safety and into the world of resources. So in short, dopamine is the molecule that says, hey, you need to go find food, you need to seek social connection, you need to find shelter, and you need to reproduce. And because it is also a precursor to epinephrine, that's another way to say adrenaline, it also helps create the action to get us to those resources. Now, another thing to keep in mind about dopamine is that we just felt the contrast between dopamine and H&N neurotransmitters, right? These two systems work in counterbalance to each other. So dopamine paints this rosy picture of the future, whereas H&N neurotransmitters help us really enjoy something for what it is, not what it can become. So when dopamine is low, H&Ns are high and vice versa. And like biologically, this makes sense, right? So dopamine tells us to crave, to look, to pursue things outside of ourselves, to go look for resources and satisfaction. It also says, let's create some action to go get that. And so then you get a spike of dopamine right as you're fantasizing about something that you're about to pursue. And then also when you get an unexpected reward while you're in that pursuit. H&Ns, on the other hand, says, I'm enjoying what's right here, right now. I'm not focused on this thing, this experience being different, and I'm not focused on what it can become. So there's really no reason for me to move. I can just stay here and I'm pretty happy. Now, the most popular way that I've heard dopamine spoken of is when we talk about social media as a dopamine hit. It is used to describe the why behind addictive behaviors, which all sounds a bit negative, but that's only because we're describing what happens when dopamine is not balanced. Dopamine, when it is functioning how it's intended, is what drives the evolution of our lives. The problem is that with human development and technology, there is no shortage of what captures our attention for desire and longing. So as a result, we develop imbalances in dopamine. All right, so let's talk about how dopamine works. Essentially, we have a baseline of dopamine that's circulating in our systems all the time. And I'm going to walk us through a real world situation to track like how and when dopamine is released. So let's say you're craving a burrito because you haven't had one in a while. Dopamine's job is to get your butt off the couch so that you can get that dopamine spike, which then converts to epinephrine or adrenaline. And then that creates the action so you can go get that burrito. So for nervous system nerds, yes, dopamine triggers that sympathetic arousal response. So let's say you get to your favorite taqueria, and then the server that you've got a crush on is working, and then they sneak you a surprise side of guacamole. As you're eating your burrito, you're fantasizing about your crush, and then also from getting that unexpected side of guacamole. But now you've eaten the burrito and you're home alone again, your crush didn't ask you out, and your dopamine levels go down. They don't go down just to baseline, but they go actually below baseline. So the bigger the dopamine spike, the lower the valley. So in other words, dopamine spikes with 1, the anticipation and possibility of a burrito, 2, when you are enjoying the burrito, 3, when you receive an unexpected surprise, in this case, it's guacamole, while you're pursuing that burrito, and then 4, with the anticipation and possibility of your crush asking you out. So the weird thing about dopamine is that that's not consistent. Let's say you eat a burrito every day for a month. Over time, because you've come to expect this burrito, the novelty of it wears off. The dopamine spike that you associate with enjoyment as you're like eating that burrito, that no longer happens. So they've tested this on rats in laboratories. So first they track dopamine levels in rats who are given a treat and they get a dopamine spike. And then they turned on a light that was associated with the treat. And what they found is that the rats got a dopamine spike with both the light and the treat. But then over time and repeated cycles of lights and treats, they no longer got a spike with the treat. They only got the spike when the light came on. So this cyclical nature of dopamine is important. Your experience of motivation and drive is related to the fluctuations in relationship to your recent levels of dopamine. Now, dopamine is a bit of a Goldilocks neuromodulator, meaning that you don't want your baseline to be too high or too low. And your dopamine baseline is highly influenced by your actions. So in particular, if you live your life from a place where you are constantly seeking, that baseline ratchets up and up and up, which then results in you feeling underwhelmed from things that normally brought you joy. But if that baseline of dopamine is set high, the spike has to be that much higher. And when dopamine spikes that high, it's going to be a valley. You're going to encounter a valley on the other side of that that's really low, which is why so many people experience like a hangover after peak experiences. So in extreme cases, I don't know if you can see this thread here, but dopamine physiology is the explanation of addiction. It's not necessarily that the substance or the activity that they're seeking, it's actually the dopamine spike that they're trying to get to. The irony with addiction is that the pleasure loses the sparkle over time, just like that burrito that you ate for a month straight. So dopamine explains why when you repeatedly engage in something that you enjoy, your threshold for that enjoyment goes up and up and up. And addiction is really a narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. Over time and repetitions of the addictive behavior or substance, what we do is we develop a resistance. And this is another way of saying that the dopamine baseline has ratcheted up to the point that there needs to be more and more stimulation to get that dopamine spike that these people are seeking. You also have to consider the dopamine valley and what that experience is like. I have a history of alcoholism. And when I think back to that time, it got to the point that I wasn't drinking for that dopamine spike. I was drinking to avoid the dopamine valley. And a hangover doesn't quite adequately describe what it felt like after a night of partying and drinking, because it doesn't explain the emotional low that comes from it as well. It's easier to stay at that low level of drunkenness to avoid the crash of the dopamine valley. So when I listened to the Huberman podcast, he talks about different substances and activities and in relationship to like how far above the baseline it spikes you. So chocolate spikes 1.5 times above baseline. It's pretty transient. It only lasts for a few minutes to a few seconds. Sex, the pursuit of and the act of sex, spikes you 2 times over baseline. Nicotine, very, very short-lived, 2.5 times above baseline. Cocaine, also 2.5 times over baseline. And amphetamine is 10 times over baseline. So based on this, we can now see why amphetamine is so addictive compared to, let's say, chocolate. It's because that spike is so high, but also that corresponding valley is also really, really low. So folks who get addicted to amphetamines are chasing the high, but also trying to avoid the low. So now that we've got a sense of how dopamine works, let's talk about how it shows up during an offer launch. Because even subtle fluctuations in dopamine affect how we feel about life. So know that when you're going into a launch, you're voluntarily entering into a moment in your entrepreneurial life that's inherently going to have some ungrounding fluctuations in dopamine. Instead of making something wrong about this or wrong about us or glossing it over, I want to help us understand what's going on so that we can accept what we can and cannot change and give us some ideas to help us feel grounded. Let's talk about launching. Think about what a launch is. You are envisioning who you'd like to work with. You're hoping to reach a goal of how much money you'd like to make or how many people you'd like to have in your container. You're tapping into why you do what you do so that you could talk about it in your marketing. So it's not a burrito, but you can see how craving, desire, motivation, and drive are all a natural and a normal part of launching. Now, it's easier to think about a burrito as a resource that you go outside of your body to go get, but a launch brings in money, which is also an important resource. I coincidentally watched a reel on Instagram yesterday. I don't know how these reels end up on my suggested feed, but it was titled "A Day in the Life of a Rich Dubai Housewife." And it showed this perfectly coiffed woman going through her day, eating all these extravagant meals all day long, ordering multiple entrees because she couldn't decide what she wanted. She was drinking cocktails that were laced with 24 karat gold. She was getting her hair and her nails done, getting spa treatments, massages. She accidentally spent $2,000 at Lululemon. You get the picture, right? I couldn't help but view this reel through the lens of her dopamine levels because I was preparing for this talk. So dopamine spikes are natural and they're an important part of how we move and pursue things. However, when we layer dopaminergic activities, it changes what would be a novel experience into a normal one. And what that means is that we have to then ramp up experiences in the pursuit of a dopamine spike. So it's why this Dubai housewife has to layer multiple experiences into her day to feel fulfilled. Now, my own intention when it comes to how I stay balanced with dopamine is to try to keep my day-to-day experiences as a wave as it fluctuates between dopamine and H&N neurotransmitters. Now, we know that we are going to flow up and down, but we can influence how smooth that flow is through our actions and our mindset. So knowing that every client who signs on, I'm going to have a dopamine peak. Like that's just a biological process that's going to happen. And then I'm also going to have a corresponding dopamine valley. So that means that I'm going to be aware of how my body experiences dopamine. In other words, I want the launch to be the dopaminergic experience that it is. I don't want to layer in optional dopamine, which is going to raise my baseline with that corresponding crash that lowers it. So when I'm in the middle of a launch, I am being very disciplined about eating whole nourishing foods that stabilize my blood sugar. I don't drink alcohol very often these days, but I'm not drinking right now. I'm being really mindful that the sugar that I eat is from fruit. And I know that eating processed food layers dopamine. So I make it a point to not eat snacks that are coming from a box or a bag during these times. And I don't abstain from caffeine because you can pry my coffee out of my cold, dead hands, but I do limit it. I limit it to 1 cup of coffee or chai a day. Another way that we layer dopamine is the phone. And the phone is a tricky thing because it's not just this like singular thing, right? It's a way to listen to music. It's a way to listen to podcasts. It's a way to stay connected to your friends by calling or texting them. It's a way to share your latte art with the world. There's games, there's shopping. All of that is dopamine because the phone is a novelty machine. I know that I've personally ping-ponged between different apps while I lose complete track of time. And this is because the phone layers a bunch of different ways to access dopamine. And so, of course, it's really hard to stay grounded after that. So during a launch, I'm limiting my phone use. In fact, I have no phone days on the days that my husband and I have off together. So I'll check in on my client messages in the morning and in the evening, and I'll check in with my friends in those times. But the phone is literally put away in a drawer for the whole day, because layering all these dopamine triggering sources causes that crash afterwards. It undermines longer-term motivation and drive. To bring more pleasure to the things in my life that I really want to enjoy, I have to choose to not layer. And thanks, Francisco. He just shared a comment that says, wow, that explains a lot. I've been burnt out from the dopamine valley before. I think we all have, right? So when I know that my dopamine spikes can't be avoided, the way that I replenish the pool of dopamine is to limit the optional dopaminergic behaviors that I engage in, that I choose to engage in. Just as like a little sidebar, ADHD is often associated with this lower dopamine baseline, which is why there are such extreme fluctuations of not being able to focus and stay on task with these moments of hyperfocus. What we're seeing in ADHD is extreme spikes and valleys of dopamine. So remember how I was sharing that the extent to how low the valley is proportional to how high the peak is. This becomes especially relevant during a successful launch. Marketing coaches are all about that 10K month, so I'm going to work with that example. If you are used to making around 10K per month already, your dopamine during a launch, and let's say you make 10K during a launch, your dopamine is going to spike a little bit and then it's going to dip a little bit below baseline. So you might not even feel the valley in this case. However, let's say it's your first time making 10K. You never thought you'd make this much money in your business. So that subsequent valley is going to dip quite a bit below baseline because that spike was so high. So it's going to dip down below. And this happened to me. I had a 10K month in 2021. I had my first 10K month in 2021 when I was a student in a business accelerator program. I went from making about 3 to 4K regularly and then jumping up to 10K. And as soon as that happened, I fell straight into that dopamine valley. I couldn't explain it, but I had so much anxiety about that first successful launch. Meanwhile, everyone in my group coaching program was so excited for me. even though I was having insomnia and my heart palpitations were coming back. No one normalized this experience for me because everyone thinks about that peak experience and how like exciting that high is. And then we mask that dopamine valley because it seems shameful that we'd be upset when something joyful happened to us. Dopamine is the marker of anticipation and possibility. It idealizes the unknown. And so once that unknown is known, its job is done. So particularly if the accomplishment took a lot of effort, that valley is going to drop. It's going to bottom out. So remember in that burrito example, how you were fantasizing about your crush? This is what happens when the dopamine rush of the chase dies down and they actually do ask you out, but it's not grounded with H&N molecules like serotonin and oxytocin. So if you don't make that shift from dopamine to serotonin and oxytocin, you're going to get that valley. That first 10K month, I don't know where I spent the money, how I spent the money, but I spent 10K that month. When I frame my behavior in the context of understanding dopamine, the dopamine valley was so unbearable that I shopped to get my baseline back up. Shopping is a dopaminergic activity, right? It's no different to what I was doing when I was day drinking to avoid the hangover. So this explains why after peak experiences, we experience a low. If you've ever experienced a vulnerability hangover after you finished up a presentation that you worked really hard on, or you felt the post-vacation blues or even postpartum depression, this is happening because your dopamine baseline shifted really, really dramatically outside of your window of tolerance. Now, I want to share how I work with the cycles of dopamine in practical ways that help me feel balanced. The first is that I allow myself to rest after peak dopamine experiences, because these experiences are part of the joy and the expression of life. I don't want to shield myself from joy. I don't want to shield other people from joy because they're afraid of that valley. That's not how we have rich and exciting lives. But we should be aware of how your body is going to process that experience. What we experience as a dopamine valley crash is how the body is communicating that you need to rest and slow down and integrate that experience. We are all meant to go through yin states, particularly after high yang states. We have depression after these peak states because capitalism tells us that we need to keep moving and get going towards new goals without integration. So I rest and I integrate and I give my body full permission to slow down for a moment without creating a new goal. This is also the reason why I have long launches. Right now, I am halfway through launching Business Alchemist Mentorship. It is a 2-month launch and it is 2 months on purpose. And I find that this pace serves me and my clients really well. On one hand, when I give my potential clients a long period to consider the program, I know that they're not signing up because I've spiked their dopamine. This is a critical moment in my business even when I'm seeking clients, I'm infusing my communication with attraction energy by showing up unapologetically as myself so that my potential clients can feel the serotonin pull and decide if this is aligned for them or not. My long launches give them space to move through the fantasy of their dopamine spike and say yes based on alignment and based on regulation. A long launch also allows me to not have a layered, concentrated dopamine spike because the enrollments don't come in all at once. Right now, I have 6 folks who are signed up for BAM, with about 8 more who have messaged me saying that they're seriously considering it. If I had all 14 people sign up within a week, that dopamine spike would have me completely spinning. This way, I get to savor each enrollment with gratitude. Gratitude is another tool that I work with to smooth out those dopamine spikes. Part of the intoxicating smell of dopamine comes from reaching the end result. This is called an extrinsic experience, meaning that the catalyst for the dopamine spike comes from something outside of yourself. So when I lean into the friction of a launch and I find both intangible and tangible layers to celebrate within the launch itself, I am creating small intrinsic, which is within myself, intrinsic dopamine spikes. So in the BAM private Slack group, we have a channel called Celebrations where we do just this. So in this particular launch, I'm celebrating that I was able to successfully receive tons of feedback from BAM alumni so that I can continue to improve how I deliver BAM. I am also celebrating that I figured out that I love teaching live, and it's giving me lots of opportunities to do that. So when somebody signs up for BAM, it's just part of the current and the wave of the launch. It's not an experience that spikes and then valleys me into disassociation. So I recognize that this sounds a little bit counter to what I just shared about layering optional dopamine spikes. But how gratitude is different from me scrolling on my phone is that it brings in the H&N molecules, which allows me to stay present through an experience. I want to have a long-term relationship with my business, and long-term relationships are not built on dopamine. I had a pivotal moment that I shared on episode 111 of my podcast where I realized that I had been holding my business at arm's length, and it took my business grinding to a halt for me to pay attention and to actually decide that I want to be in a long-term serotonin-based relationship with my business. So by recruiting the H&N molecules during a launch, these are largely molecules that are involved in long-term bonding. It is reinforcing my intention that everything is relational. My business and I are in a long-term committed relationship, so I actively find ways to activate molecules like serotonin and oxytocin to reinforce that bond. The lovely side effect of this is that when clients choose to work with me, they get to also experience the trust and the security that's folded into my relationship with my business. I like to think of it as going and having dinner with my best friend, Christina, and her partner, John, because they have a secure relationship. I can feel the lightness and the love that's in the room. It's comfortable to be around. Their love isn't about me, but I definitely get to experience the side effect of being in the presence of a couple that truly loves and respects each other, and they have fun together. It makes it easy for me to be awash in my own H&N molecules when I'm with them. In contrast, I've had dinners with couples who have had a big rift in their relationship. Being a sensitive person, even without them sharing what's going on, I can feel that tension in the air. And it forces me to think about the future. I can't stay in the present moment when I'm around people like that. So I'm thinking, what do I need to say to make this a little bit more comfortable? How do I iron out this wrinkle here? How do I get out of here, right? So I definitely want my clients to come into a space that's a lot more like having dinner with Christina and John. And it's my own responsibility to create that kind of relationship between me and my business to invite my clients into. Another thing that I do during a launch is exercise the muscle of intrinsic rewards. There was a Stanford study done with children. Don't worry, it's not a scary study, even though they involve kids. They took a group of young kids who were already artistically inclined, meaning they didn't need someone to tell them to do art. They were just really excited to do art. The act of creating art was the reward itself for them. All the study did was attach a reward to the art, a gold star for their effort. What they found was that the reward spiked their dopamine, which led to a valley, which drops their baseline, and now they are less likely to feel motivated to create art. Simply adding a reward to something that they already love doing reduced their desire to engage with art. So when we focus on the reward, we delay the spike in dopamine so that there's less pleasure in the effort and in the doing. If you push for the end goal that comes later, you enjoy that process less. You make it more painful. You become less efficient at it, and you undermine your ability to continue to engage in it in the future. So this all comes down to the why behind a launch, particularly when it comes to marketing materials. If everything that I create in my marketing is simply about getting the reward of a full roster of clients at the end, I'm doing the same thing that the researchers did to those artistic kids. Instead, I try to amplify effort through intrinsic rewards by focusing on the striving itself as the reward. By creating content that I want to nerd out about and talk about anyway, This talk is one of those things. I spent the last week just like deeply immersed in researching dopamine. And oh my gosh, my nerdy little heart was so happy. And I also do this by honoring the friction, the struggle of launching. I remind myself that I have choice in this effort. In other words, I smooth out the spikes before I engage in the launch, and I smooth out the dopamine spikes after the launch, and I learn to create waves of dopamine through the actual effort itself. Francisco, I'm just going to read out your comment out loud here. Navigating from wild surfing waves to pleasant lake-like waters. Exactly. That's exactly the visual that I had as well. Yeah. So another thing about dopamine is that dopamine loves fantasy. Dopamine is the molecule of obsessive yearning. So another way that I stay grounded is I stay rooted in reality, not in fantasy. And I definitely need help with this one when I'm in the middle of a launch. Dopamine is not rational. It swings wildly from, I'm going to have 100 people sign up for BAM to no one's going to sign up for BAM at all. So I need to do lots more marketing. It's so helpful that I have Andre, who's my business partner, who's been with me from the very beginning. And he reminds me all the time, sometimes on a daily basis. We've been here before. We have X amount of signups right now. So like, just chill out. It's also really helpful when my husband reminds me that he has a job as well. So the launch isn't going to be the determining factor of us being able to pay our mortgage or put food on the table or feed my horses. So when dopamine tries to take over, co-regulation is the counterbalance because it grounds the fantasy, both the negative and the positive, in reality. So another thing that I think is really important during a launch is to ask for support, ask for help. And then I try my best and I stay unattached to the results. Dopamine helps us accomplish things, but dopamine can have a bit of a critical voice. Dopamine says, you didn't make as much as you did in the last launch. And this somehow feels like a failure. Capitalism feeds into this. The expectation in a business is that each year you need to make more than the last year and then more the following year and up and up and up into this linear growth land. H&N help us appreciate things when we get them. Dopamine is focused on always getting more, acquiring more. Hunger and satiation is experienced in the here and now. Now, of course, I go into each launch with a number of clients in mind that I'd like to enroll. But in the assessment after a launch, I ask myself about hunger and satiation. The number of students I enroll is not a marker of my success or of my failure. It is information. If I'm still hungry after a launch, I have to think, okay, so is there something that I need to do differently next time? What kind of questions do I need to be answering for my future clients? How can I set myself up better next time? How many one-on-one clients do I need to open up to make sure that the business continues to run smoothly for the rest of the year? If I am satiated, I celebrate. And I also ask myself, okay, so what worked this time? What can I recreate for the next launch? Do I need to reduce my one-on-one client spots so that I have the capacity to deliver the care that I really want to this group that feels really big? Honestly, at the end of the day, what I've learned is that being with the waves of dopamine has helped me build resilience. By knowing what dopamine feels like in my body, I can create choices around how I want to engage with dopaminergic activities instead of being a slave to the whims of chasing dopamine spikes and avoiding dopamine valleys. So sit with all this for a moment. How does gaining an understanding of dopamine land in your body? Does it fill in a little bit of color on your spiritual entrepreneurship journey? Thank you so much for nerding out with me for the last little bit about dopamine. I hope that what you are taking away from this conversation is that with a lot of these challenges that we experience in our lives and in our businesses, it's not just about throwing another tool, another strategy into the mix. We have to start asking why. And sometimes that why is rooted in the nervous system. Why does that feel threatening? where does that story come from? And then sometimes that why is rooted in biology. And I think that that's why dopamine kind of fills in color where nervous system work has felt a little bit black and white for me. Now, with the dopamine system, we can't fight against biology. And so we have to figure out ways to work with biology. And to me, what we're speaking about is really about resilience. And I had one more thing that I wanted to share that just came to me after I had recorded this live lecture. And I thought I would share it here with you on this podcast recording. So we're going to talk about a portion of the brain called the anterior midcingulate cortex and its relationship to resilience in particular, and its relationship to challenges and your ability to lean into challenges. So the anterior midcingulate cortex, it's a part of the brain, and it gets inputs from a bunch of different systems. It gets inputs from both dopamine and the H and N molecules, the here and now molecules, including serotonin and oxytocin. And what neurobiologists have found is that if you tickle that part of the brain with an electrode, people consistently share, hey, I feel like there's a storm coming towards me, but I know that I'm going to be able to get through it. I know that there is something that's about to happen, but we can lean into it. And what I find interesting about this part of the brain is that it is plastic, both in function and in size. And so it increases in size when people take on hard challenges on a consistent basis. And it decreases in size when they are shying away from challenges. Another thing that they found with this particular part of the brain is that it is increased in size in a group of people called superagers. Superagers are folks who are able to age and maintain cognitive ability late into life. And, I think that there's a lot of ways that people are trying to seek wellness late into life. And so, that can be taken on through the context of diet and exercise and community. But what they found in particular with the anterior midcingulate cortex is it's really well developed in people who are superagers, and the key characteristic that they have in common is that they're constantly learning, they're constantly taking on new challenges. And so ultimately what that is showing us is that this part of the brain grows under conditions when we lean into things that feel really hard, and in particular when we lean into things that we don't want to do. Now, I can fully apply this into a launch, right? I'm going to be totally honest with you. I really don't enjoy launching. It's not my favorite part of my business. If I could just, run my business, deliver quality care to my clients without launching a single thing, I would sign up for that. But the reality is that for this kind of work that we do, where we're, in cohorts, where there's group courses, it's kind of hard to move away from that and still maintain that connectivity. And so by default, I have to launch. It's something that I don't like doing. It's a challenge for me. And I also know that the more I'm able to lean into that challenge, the more resilience I am building and the more capacity that I'm building in my own nervous system and my dopamine system to be able to handle these hard things that are in life. An example of resilience that I can give you is that when I raise plants from seedlings, and so I haven't been able to do it this year because my garden is brand new, but in the past, what I've done is we start seedlings inside, put them under lights, keep them nice and warm, and then as they start sprouting up, we introduce little stressors to them, introduce things that aren't going to kill them, but is going to stress them out a little bit. And so we do that by blowing on them. Sometimes we turn some fans on them. I'll put them outside for a couple hours and sort of increase the amount of time that they're going outside. And so then they're having exposure to sun in ways that are uncomfortable. I think that if I were to interview these little seedlings, I'm just going to use tomato seedlings as an example. If I were to interview them, they'd be kind of bummed out that I'm stressing them out, right? But ultimately, what happens is that when we give an organism little stressors and they're able to rise to the challenge and they're able to meet that challenge and move through that challenge, it builds up their resilience. And so then I'm able to trust that when I put that little tomato plant in the ground outside, it's going to be able to grow up into a nice, healthy tomato plant because it's now going to be able to withstand wind. It's going to be able to withstand varying degrees of moisture. It's going to be able to withstand rain and sun. And I know that like little tomato plants don't have an anterior mid-cingulate cortex, but I think that the human version of building resilience in that tomato is building and exercising that anterior mid-cingulate cortex. Something to note is that this part of the brain does not care about the stuff that is hard, but you actually want to do. The growth actually comes from leaning into the hard stuff that you don't want to do. And I know that we talk a lot in this community about listening to the body, doing what you want to do, and being on purpose, following your Tao, but you still have to put an effort into some things that feel like maybe not the most exciting. So the example that I'd like to bring in from my own business is I don't love doing bookkeeping. I don't look forward to it every month. It's not my favorite thing. And I also see the value in doing it. So I'm probably going to be that like one business coach who's like, I actually don't recommend that people hire a bookkeeper right off the bat. And my bookkeeper actually agrees with this because as a newer business owner, it is incredibly helpful to like be in your books every month so that you know what amount of money is coming in, what amount of money is flowing out, and you can really keep tabs on how your money is working for you in your business. And it also allows you to have tangible ways of investing in your business as well. So I'm always looking at my books when I want to take a new course, or if I feel like I want to hire a new person. So it's incredibly helpful for me to know the flow of money that's happening in my business, because then it allows me to plan for the future. So it allows me to make safe decisions around, hey, I want to invest in this course, or I want to hire somebody to do a particular task in my business. And having a solid grasp on the finances because I'm in my books every month helps me make those decisions in a really safe way. This is not to say that I won't ever hire a bookkeeper again, but I really think that, again, here's a place where my anterior mid-cingulate cortex is growing. It is becoming more plastic. It is developing flexibility. It is leaning into those hard edges of something that I don't want to do. And again, building resilience in myself also means I'm building resilience in my own business. So I think in short, what the motto, I guess, of the anterior mid-cingulate cortex is, sometimes the effort is supposed to suck. And it's okay that that effort kind of sucks sometimes, as long as you have that big picture in mind and that sucky effort is really feeding into your ability to feed into that bigger picture. So that is the last thing I wanted to share about resilience. I think that it's a core part of how we talk about dopamine, and it just sort of came to me after the fact, and I just was like, it feels like an incomplete talk unless I share this as well. Now, if these kinds of conversations are interesting to you, and in particular what I mean by that is if you are somebody who has tried all the strategies and all the tools and you're like, I still feel stuck, I still feel frozen, I still don't understand why I can't do X, Y, and Z that's going to help me launch or continue or cultivate my business, there is oftentimes a very understandable reason behind it. And for me, I always love to go back to biology. So if this kind of conversation feels really juicy for you, it's sparking your curiosity, if it's helping you understand yourself better, and it's giving you a sense of empowerment, it's giving you a sense of compassion for yourself, because we now know that it's not something that you have to be shamed about. It's really just something that you have to understand and learn how to work with. I would love to have a conversation with you about Business Alchemist Mentorship. It is my group coaching program. It runs for a year. If you're listening to this before June 29th, that's the last date of enrollment for Business Alchemist Mentorship for 2024. So I only run it once a year. And so if you miss the deadline for this, that means that you're going to have to wait another full year. I probably won't run it until fall of 2025. But in this program, you're going to get the strategy. You're going to get what I call like the yang aspects of running a business, but we also get into the yin aspects of running a business, and you get community with all of this as well. So if you're curious, hop on over to my website, businessalchemistmentorship.com. There, you're welcome to browse through all the information. You can just sign up right there, or I'm happy to hop on a connection call with you. So that's all I got for this week. Sending you lots of love on your journey as a spiritual entrepreneur. And I am also really advocating for us understanding our bodies better. So thank you so much for being here, for really even caring about your body enough to learn this stuff. And we'll see each other really soon.